This podcast is for educational purposes, and all questions related to medical care should be directed to your physician or healthcare provider. Since our guests aren't scripted and are free to speak their minds, their views and opinions don't necessarily reflect those of BridgeBio Pharma. Now, we hope you enjoy the podcast.
Hello and welcome to On Rare, a rare disease podcast produced by BridgeBio, a biotech company that works on developing treatments for rare diseases. At On Rare, we explore what it's really like to live with a rare disease. I'm your host, Mandy Rohrig, a member of the Patient Advocacy team, and with me, as always, is the head of Patient Advocacy at BridgeBio, David Rintell. Hi, David. Great to see you.
Hi, Mandy. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, me too. So today we're talking with Sean. Sean lives with ATTR amyloidosis, a really nice person. He lives in New Hampshire, and those of us who live in Massachusetts, so we have a bit of a rivalry. We call it New Hampster. Sorry to insult anyone from New Hampshire with that. But I think
Suddenly we have 0 listeners in New Hampshire.
Sean is a really interesting person, and we met him because he's on a speakers bureau of patients who educate others about ATTR amyloidosis.
Yeah, it'll be really great to hear a little bit more about his story. First, Dr. Jonathan Fox will give us an overview of ATTR and help us to better understand the medical side of this condition.
Yeah, thank you, Mandy. We have an entire podcast episode featuring Dr. Fox, and if we can figure out how to do this, we'll post that up again following this episode. It's really informative, and Jonathan is a great storyteller. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us once again on Rare.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
I did say that we'd like to have you on every podcast, so that's part of the reason why we have invited you back. Sean, whom we will hear from very soon, has an interesting type of ATTR amyloidosis. He has something called the T80 variant, and that gives him symptoms of both ATTR with cardiomyopathy and ATTR with polyneuropathy. But I'm hoping you could talk to us about Sean's experience with ATTR and why he seems to have both types.
Sure, I'd be happy to try. Transthyretin amyloidosis is a systemic disease. And what that means is any tissues and organs that are exposed to the bloodstream are susceptible to getting infiltrated with TTR amyloid. One interesting exception, or a rare exception, is the central nervous system, which has a barrier between the blood and the brain and the spinal cord, really mostly the brain. It's exceedingly unusual. What is reasonably common, and in fact worldwide, the type of amyloidosis that causes polyneuropathy is most prevalent around the globe, even though the cardiomyopathy may be more prevalent in certain geographies where some of these specific variants have been passed along in families, such as in Sean's situation. So there's a spectrum of TTR amyloidosis that ranges from highly predominant cardiomyopathy or a form of heart failure. And then on the other end of the spectrum, some individuals have almost a highly predominant involvement of the peripheral nervous system. And then there are people in the middle, like Sean and his family, and people with who carry that same T80 variant, sometimes also called T60A. It's the same thing. And it's often called the Scots-Irish variant because it originated in the British Isles. And as it turns out, T80 in particular is the largest number of people who have a mixed phenotype with both the heart involvement and the nervous system involvement.
That's very helpful. Are there any other differences for people with the T80 variant?
T68 tends to have an onset of symptoms somewhere in the mid-30s to mid-60s age range. Dependent on the genetic background, an earlier onset may be more prevalent in one family carrying the same variant compared to a different family. It's also highly dependent how the patient presents for medical attention and at what stage of their development of their disease. Some people are highly attuned to their body and they say, yeah, this isn't right. I'm going to seek advice of a doctor. It's been pointed out in the patient advocacy world that patients with these disorders really have to be their own advocate, and their family members need to advocate for them as well. Busy doctors, have busy practices. They see many patients in a day, and they just may not be tuned into well, could this be TTR amyloidosis? And late diagnosis and misdiagnosis is true of ATTR, both the cardiomyopathic and the polyneuropathic. If anything, the polyneuropathic presents more of a challenge for diagnostics. The initial symptoms may be quite mild. It's the tingling in the toes. It's the somewhat a loss of sensation, the onset of GI symptoms, intermittent diarrhea and constipation.
Jonathan, just as you were talking about differential diagnosis, how do you distinguish between this polyneuropathy and, say, a more common form of neuropathy, such as diabetic neuropathy?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And the answer is through a neurological physical examination, nerve conduction studies, as well as tests of blood pressure with postural changes. And finally, one of the best ways to really nail the diagnosis is with a peripheral nerve biopsy, showing infiltration of the nervous system with TTR amyloid.
Interesting. So it's not terribly uncommon for a neurologist to perhaps make this diagnosis then.
Well, I would say that it almost requires a knowledgeable neurologist to make the proper diagnosis, and even the proportion of neurologists who are, as I mentioned earlier, kind of tuned in to the possibility that this could be amyloid is not as widespread as one might wish it to be. Now, I think it's important to also recognize that now that there are therapies available to patients with ATTR polyneuropathy, it's kind of moved closer to front and center for many practicing neurologists that, oh, what we've been calling this could be actually that. Or the fact that this patient also has type 2 diabetes, we've kind of written it off as diabetic neuropathy. But if you start to look at all of the different parts of the nervous system that can be affected, it starts to exclude some of those alternative diagnoses.
Yep.
The symptoms taken one at a time could represent a variety of illnesses and are hard to diagnose. But I think what you're saying is if you put each of the pieces together, it starts to look like ATTR with polyneuropathy. So
That's right.
Well, this has really been enormously helpful, Jonathan. Once again, it's a delight to have you with us on the podcast.
Always great to join you.
Sean, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you. It's nice to participate.
Nice for us as well. So tell us about yourself.
Sure. My name's Sean. I'm 61 years old. I live in New Hampshire with my wife and 2 dogs. I've got a disease called hereditary amyloidosis. I was diagnosed in early March of 2019. After a period of about 6 or 7 years, symptoms were starting to build in, but none of the doctors could tie it all together. So that's my medical self.
And the rest of yourself?
Yeah, so I am 75% retired right now. Yeah.
I'm laughing because I always tell people that retirement is like pregnancy. Either you are or you aren't.
Right. Well, I do a little bit of online teaching for Excelsior University in their nuclear engineering technology program.
Oh, well, that is impressive. I hope you're not going to ask me any questions about nuclear engineering.
Well, if I do, I'll keep them simple.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
I spent 30 years in the nuclear power industry as a licensed senior reactor operator. As a youngster, I played ice hockey, and I played in men's leagues all the way up to when my symptoms didn't allow me to do that anymore. So I was a strong individual. And that comes into play when we kind of discuss my journey to diagnosis.
Sean, you are a New Englander. You've played hockey all your life. Were you involved at Seabrook?
Yes, I spent 31 years there.
Oh,
Yep.
wow, that is impressive. Seabrook is a nuclear power plant kind of along the New Hampshire coastline.
Yep. Yeah, it's Seabrook, New Hampshire, correct.
I guess take us back to what you first noticed that eventually led to your diagnosis.
Sure. So I've got hereditary amyloidosis. The variant is called T80. It seems to be specific to Irish people. My name's Sean, so you can do the math on that one. I was diagnosed early March of 2019. However, symptoms started setting in probably 6 to 7 years prior to that. The first symptom that I got, I was experiencing carpal tunnel in both of my hands. So I had carpal tunnel surgery on both my hands at a local hospital in New Hampshire. And I didn't really think anything of it. My job entailed a lot of handwriting and typing and whatnot. So I just figured it was the normal way you get carpal tunnel. Little did I know, and little did the hand surgeon didn't know, but that was actually the first symptom of the disease. And it's very typical. A lot of patients we see that their first symptom was carpal tunnel. Had they taken a biopsy, they probably would have found amyloid in the tissues of my wrist. Shortly thereafter, I started experiencing numbness in my left foot and in my ankle. Now, I had previously had vascular surgery on that leg, and one of the incisions was down at the ankle. So I just attributed to that. I figured maybe nerve damage from the surgery. Again, little did I know. Fast forward about another 2 years, I had this uneasiness in my chest and dizziness. I was taken to the hospital, did all the tests for cardiac event. It all came back negative. This time, they did an angiogram on my heart and went in there, and he got the results, and he sat down and showed me the results. And he said to me, he goes, Sean, not only is your heart healthy, if you look at these images, it looks rather robust. He goes, I think you've got an athlete's heart. And he jokingly said, if I were you, I'd go home and train for the Boston Marathon.
Really?
Well, I'm glad I didn't heed his advice, because what he likely was seeing was enlargement of my left ventricle from amyloid getting lodged in it.
Wow.
So, Sean, you had carpal tunnel surgery. Did that resolve your issues that you were having in your hands, or did that continue?
It did for a little while, but gradually over time, the numbness came back. I actually had another surgery done about 1.5 years ago on one of the hands, and it didn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
I had surgery on 3 of my fingers for trigger finger. I've heard from other amyloidosis patients that have gotten trigger finger as well. So yes, so then I was experiencing numbness in my left foot and ankle. Again, I had surgery on that leg, and I figured it was probably nerve damage due to that. Little did I know it's the peripheral neuropathy starting to make its way up my extremities. I'm at the point now where, fortunately, the therapy that I've been on has halted the disease progression, but it did travel up. I've got neuropathy all the way up through my legs into my lower abdomen. And then I've got neuropathy in my hands and up my arms.
So for those of our listeners that are unfamiliar with neuropathy, Sean, can you describe what neuropathy is and what that feels like to you?
Sure. The best way I can describe the feeling, I tell people, if you've ever gone to the dentist and have a Novocaine and it's about halfway worn off, it almost feels like pins and needles. So that's what I experience continuously. I also will get muscle cramps, especially in my legs. The neurologist told me that that's due to the nerve endings sending errant signals to the muscles. The other thing that's happened is I've got muscle atrophy in both legs, which has severely decreased or hindered my ability to walk, although I can walk.
Because you have decreased sensation or altered sensation in your legs, is that what is contributing to the atrophy or the decreased muscle strength that you have in your legs?
That's what I've been told. That happened gradually. I probably started noticing 3 to 4 years prior to diagnosis that my legs seemed to be getting weak. I can walk around fairly well. I have walking sticks that I bought, and if I hold the walking sticks, I can walk almost fine. And the neurologist explained to me that that's because the neuropathy, my feet, the nerve sensations aren't going up to my brain, so the whole balance thing is off. And then in my hands, I often get, and this is the one that really hurts, it seems to happen only to my left hand, it'll cramp up, the fingers will curl up, and that hurts really bad. And it probably happens to me, I would say definitely daily.
Yeah. So when you don't have good sensation in your feet and in your legs, it's difficult to feel the ground and to orient your body as you're moving around. And that in turn challenges your balance.
Correct.
The walking sticks have helped to provide some stability and allow you to stay mobile.
Yeah. And that's on flat surfaces. Stairs and inclines are Almost impossible. I have to grab handrails to get upstairs. It's extremely difficult, but I can do it.
I also think there's a movement to try to get surgeons to take a biopsy sample of when they do carpal tunnel surgery, because there's a pretty good percentage of people who have carpal tunnel syndrome that have underlying ATTR, even though it hasn't been identified or diagnosed, or maybe there have not been any other symptoms, which was the case for you.
Yes, that's a great.
Yeah.
Yes.
As you explained to us, you have a genetic variant that causes you to have hereditary transthyretin amyloidosis.
Yes. So my doctor diagnoses me as having cardiomyopathy and polyneuropathy.
So you've also had cardiac symptoms.
I have cardiac symptoms that show up in testing. I'm not sure if the cardiac part is attributing to my challenge to climb stairs and whatnot. I certainly don't have the endurance that I used to. And that's where that, growing up fairly athletic comes into play. Because I was a reasonably strong man prior to the disease. So, yeah, it was cardiomyopathy with polyneuropathy.
It's a genetic disorder that affects families. And have there been other family members who have been affected by?
That's a great and kind of a loaded question. I'm one of 6 siblings. 2 of my siblings, unfortunately, are deceased. Their causes of death don't appear to be related to the disease.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
You've lost 2 siblings.
And then my 2 brothers that are still living, they both, once we found out I had the disease, they got genetically tested. Neither of them carries the mutation, which is good news for everyone downstream of them because it doesn't skip generations. My sister is, she's in her late 70s. She hasn't been tested, but if she had the mutation and the disease was going to manifest itself, it would have by now. As far as my parents are both deceased and they both died of forms of cancer. So I'm not 100% sure from whom I got it. I suspect that it was my father based on some genetic research that I've done. So my 2 children, so they're 32 and 29 years old. My 32-year-old son was tested. He does carry the mutation, and he's actually going to work with the same practice that I go to, and they're just going to monitor him for symptoms. My daughter has not been tested, and I'm still challenging her to do so.
Yeah. Does she say why she's? I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything, but I'm curious to know what her thinking is.
She's fairly young, in relation to when the disease symptoms usually start. So I think it's just a big decision for her, and I'm sure she'll do the right thing for herself.
It is a big decision, and this is an adult onset, often later adult onset, but
not always.
Yeah, not always, and not everybody really wants to read their tea leaves or their crystal ball and just want their lives to play out as they're going to. So
right. One of my siblings actually, after he got tested, I was chatting with him, and he said, I feel guilty about this. And I'm like, what do you feel guilty about? He goes, the fact that you got stuck with this. And I said, well, don't feel guilty about it. It's just a random DNA thing.
Yeah, your siblings did escape that fate. And
I think that's great.
Yeah, it's great, but I could see that, as is often the case, the unaffected siblings feel some kind of guilt or...
They've been incredibly supportive. At the time, my initial diagnosis, they suspected that I had the disease at the Cleveland Clinic in Abu Dhabi.
Really?
I got contacted by a professional recruiter to go over to Abu Dhabi and help actually write examination materials for their reactor operators to get licensed.
Wow.
So I went over there and did that. I was there maybe 2 weeks, and I actually fainted in the apartment complex where I live. So I was brought to the local hospital there, which was kind of a crude facility, if you will. I was literally in a village out in the middle of the desert. So the attending physician attributed it to the fact that I might be dehydrated, having moved over to the Middle East and extremely hot over there. So they treated me for dehydration. The same thing happened 2 weeks later. This time the doctor said, maybe there's something more going on. He said, we can't really treat you here at this small facility, but the Cleveland Clinic has a facility in Abu Dhabi. So I went to the Cleveland Clinic in Abu Dhabi and I met with a cardiologist, Dr. Salma Elaham, who's friends with me to this day. So he took this data and he finally mashed heads with one of his colleagues back here in the US. And the colleague said, it's probably a long shot, but has he been tested for amyloidosis? He did the imaging test. It came back positive. He advised me to return to the United States. I did so. Dr. Falk at the Brigham and Women's Hospital had the same test repeated and did the DNA testing. And it all came back and pointed to hereditary amyloidosis. Moving overseas probably saved my life because when I talked to Dr. Falk, he was going to have me treated with this new drug. I asked him, what would be the course of action if I don't do that treatment? And he told me that I would probably be terminal in 2 to 3 years. So that made that decision easy for me. So we started the treatment immediately. Also, it was actually a tremendous sense of relief for me to get diagnosed because as the years were winding up and the symptoms were building in, it really had an impact on me emotionally. Now, this is talking again back in New Hampshire. My local primary care physician, and I don't blame him for this, suggested that perhaps a lot of this was just in my head. I had anxiety. So I actually got to the point where I was seeing a psychologist. And I have to tell you, now that I know so many amyloidosis patients, I've heard the same thing from other people. So that was difficult for me. It wasn't easy. And I can tell you that I'll share with you that it contributed to the demise, I think, of my first marriage. So it was a very difficult situation. So finally getting a diagnosis was just a tremendous sense of relief, So now I knew that we could go forward and do something. So I ended up getting 74 infusions. So back to the emotional part of this. Even after the diagnosis, I struggled with it a little bit, emotionally. Not a little bit, a lot. But I finally came to the realization that I can go down two paths with this. I can look at it negatively or I can look at it positively. So I chose to look at it positively. And if I had not returned back here to get treated, I would not have met my, at that time, girlfriend and now my wife, Robin, who's my primary caretaker. She's my rock. When I travel to do my speaking, she travels with me to lug me through the airports and whatnot. And I realized that I had to reinvent myself. I no longer could work. I finally got to the point where I had to go on disability. So I no longer could perform my profession, and I no longer could be physically active like I had been. It's a funny story. I was just sitting around one day and I started doodling and I realized quickly that, hey, I have a knack for drawing. So that took off and I'm now a quite accomplished amateur artist.
Wow.
It makes sense to me because one of my father's brothers was a sketch artist for Walt Disney. So evidently the art thing is genetic too.
So some of the genetics worked out for you.
Yes. So I had to reinvent myself for a sense of purpose.
Yes.
So I did that. And, having been an instructor and having public speaking skills and having a science background and understanding the disease, if you will, I identified that I could do something to help spread the word. And that's when I reached out and joined the Amyloidosis Speakers Bureau and do my speaking for that. And I'm probably averaging a venue a month. I've spoken at Loyola out in Chicago, University of Chicago, Tufts University. So I identify there's an opportunity to help out, do whatever I can to, even help find a cure for it.
Sean, I love the positive changes you've made in your life. I wonder if you could tell us more about the Speakers Bureau. Am I correct that it's part of the work of Mackenzie's mission organization?
Yes, I'm so glad that you asked. Due to a young woman named Mackenzie, and I guess I can share her name, Mackenzie Boddicker. They run the Mackenzie's mission. So she got diagnosed with light chain amyloidosis. And she was in her early 20s, which is unusual. So she got treatment for light chain amyloidosis, and it's now in remission. So Mackenzie and Deb Boddicker decided to use her disease as an opportunity, and they're just doing amazing work. So we're trying to spread the word to the medical community. We speak to second year med students, and also now we are speaking to residency programs. The goal is to make an impact on people and have them remember my story and the disease. So that's what I do. I tell my story. I include the emotional part of it to make an impact.
Really wonderful.
And spread the word. And we get just tremendous feedback. The Speakers Bureau has really taken off. It's really grown. So if any of you listeners who have any connections to medical schools or residency programs that know of a venue that we can speak at, please reach out to either myself, or you can go on the internet to the Amyloidosis Speakers Bureau and contact Deb Boddicker.
Wonderful, Sean. I'm very pleased that you make this pitch, and the work of talking to medical students and other healthcare providers in training just seems so valuable to help them identify the beginning signs of amyloidosis. And I also hope when you are speaking, you'll make a pitch for this episode of the podcast. We have another episode featuring a wonderful man, Eric, with ATTR-CM, and also a great introduction to amyloidosis by our colleague, Jonathan Fox, MD. So these are resources that we hope can be really helpful, whether they be for individuals living with amyloidosis, family members, healthcare providers, or just people interested in learning more about rare diseases.
I'll take it now and I'll weave it into my speech that I give.
The more resources, the better, right?
Right.
Yeah, Sean, you and Eric do have a similar message of accentuating the positive, looking for opportunities in the face of obstacles.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you, Sean. This has been a great pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure for me as well.
So great to meet Sean today.
Yeah. Wow. I have to also remind us, he's a nuclear physicist. We don't get many of them on the podcast. So
That is true. I was struck by Sean's story for a number of reasons. While he had a long diagnostic journey, once he got it, he seemed to take charge of the situation and manage it and pay it forward by providing education and outreach and connection with the ATTR community. So Sean continued his teaching from what he had done in his professional career to now his personal life, and pretty incredible to see this journey that he has been on.
I appreciate your comment, Mandy. It makes me think that after a diagnosis of a very serious condition, there are different options one could take. You could kind of just throw in the towel and just say, well, my life now is controlled by this illness or condition. Mm-hmm. Or you can do as Sean did, is to say, well, I'm going to look at the positive parts of this experience and make of it what I can. Sean talks about 3 positives that happened to him after his diagnosis. Number 1, he met his wife. Number 2, he reinvented himself after discovering that he was good at art. And number 3 is he joined the Speakers Bureau from Mackenzie's mission, and he spends quite a lot of time educating medical students, medical professionals, and others about ATTR amyloidosis. So I guess I just have to say I am so reminded by our conversation with Eric, also living with ATTR amyloidosis, who has his theme being accentuate the positive, sings the song to us. And
he did.
I think that Sean really is accentuating the positive aspects of living with ATTR amyloidosis. It's a great example for all of us, whether we're living with a long-term chronic condition or any of the many struggles that come with life. It's possible to focus on the positives and move forward in life.
Yes, and it clearly both Sean and Eric are excellent examples of that. We're honored to speak with both of them. So thank you, David. Thank you, Sean, for sharing your experiences. And thank you, Dr. Fox, for helping us once again to better understand ATTR. Mackenzie's Mission is one of many organizations that support people living with ATTR. If you want to learn more about the Speakers Bureau or the work of Mackenzie's Mission, visit mm713.org. Thanks to our exceptional producer, Amy Brooks. If you liked this podcast, please subscribe. And if you have any questions or comments, write us at onrare@bridgebio.com. Thanks for being with us today, and we look forward to you joining us for our next conversation on Rare.